Hello everyone, and welcome to a very special episode of Cabinet of Curiosities on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier, and I'm up here at Victoria Beach, a rural municipality on the shores of Lake Winnipeg. And behind me is what at first glance would appear to be a regular old cottage, one of hundreds in this area. But if you look a little bit closer, you'll notice that something isn't quite right. You probably noticed this weird stack object right beside me here. And if you go over closer to the cottage itself, you'll notice a big circular hatch in the ground. Now, that is not the access to the septic tank, as you might assume, but actually the entrance to a Cold War fallout shelter. Now, that in itself is pretty cool, but what's even neater is that this shelter was not built by some particularly paranoid cottage owner, but was rather part of a much larger system of similar shelters built by the Canadian government between 1961 and 1963, known as the Nuclear Detonation and Fallout Reporting System, or NDFRS. And while almost forgotten today, this system was extraordinarily ambitious, extraordinarily expensive, and, as we will soon see, ultimately unsuccessful. So first, a little bit of background. Now, when the Cold War started to heat up in the 1950s and the threat of nuclear war loomed large on the horizon, different countries took radically different approaches to protecting their population in case of a nuclear exchange. Sweden, for example, devoted tons of government funds to building large communal fallout shelters, as well as mandating that builders include a fallout shelter in every new house or other building that they constructed. Canada, on the other hand, took a bit more of a hands-off approach. The government claimed it didn't have the budget or the resources to build fallout shelters for the entire population. So instead, the Emergency Measures Organization issued pamphlets containing plans and instructions for building your own fallout shelter out of lumber and cinder blocks in your basement. And these were estimated to cost around $500. Now, that doesn't seem like a lot of money today, especially with the cost of building materials, but at the time, this represented around 1/10 of the average Canadian salary. So building a shelter like that was really out of reach for most Canadians. Making things worse, at the exact same time as the government was saying they didn't have the budget to protect its own population, they embarked on a crash program to build 7 large emergency government headquarters to house government officials. And these eventually became known as Diefenbunkers, after Prime Minister John Diefenbaker, who initiated their construction. And the largest and most famous of them was built in the town of Carp, just north of Ottawa. And that one still exists. It serves as Canada's Cold War Museum, and if you're ever in the Ottawa area, I would highly recommend you check it out. It's a really neat place to visit. Now, as you can imagine, this did not sit well with the Canadian population once they found out about it. And I did find a particularly nasty letter written by a couple from Vancouver, written to Prime Minister Diefenbaker and his cabinet, which read in part, "We sincerely hope that neither you nor any civil servants with access to government shelters will be found dead, trampled in the rush to the entrance to the shelters, when those who got there first emerge in 2 weeks to mourn and bury the rest of us." So, yeah, pretty savage. But in the government's defense, they did have a fairly good reason for not wanting to build bomb shelters in cities, and that was the steady march of nuclear technology. So, early in the Cold War, civil defense preparations were based off of models that were developed during the Second World War for use with conventional bombing. And this is because early nuclear weapons in the kiloton range, like the ones used at Hiroshima and Nagasaki, were expected to only destroy a part of a city and light the rest of it on fire. So it was reasonable to think that you could have fire brigades and rescue crews go into a city after it was bombed and put out the fires and rescue people. But this wasn't the case with the development of thermonuclear weapons, because a thermonuclear weapon in the megaton range would completely obliterate a city, leaving basically nothing left to rescue or recover. So the government very quickly realized that there was no point in enacting civil defense measures of these types in the thermonuclear age, and the best way to survive a thermonuclear attack was to not be around when the bomb went off. So instead of building shelters, they instead came up with evacuation procedures where, with enough warning, they could completely evacuate Canada's main target cities. And indeed, this was refined to such an efficient process that they could theoretically evacuate a city the size of Montreal within about 2 hours. And in this respect, Canada had a bit more of an advantage than other countries, being so far away from the Soviet Union that they would have quite a bit of warning of a nuclear attack, especially with things like the distant early warning and Pine Tree radar lines in the north. And this is in stark contrast to, say, European countries like the United Kingdom, which, even in the early days when bombs had to be delivered by manned bombers, only ever had a maximum of around a half-hour warning of nuclear attack. But even with these evacuation procedures in place, there was still a huge problem, and that was fallout. Thermonuclear weapons especially tend to suck in a lot of dirt and dust and water and other materials, irradiate them, and then this fallout comes back to Earth and drifts across the land, contaminating everything in its path. And if the government didn't have some way of detecting and tracking that fallout as it drifted across the country, the people who were evacuated from the cities would just die in the countryside of radiation poisoning. So in 1959, the government started looking around for means of creating such a system. And they looked around to other countries to see what they were doing. Now, in the States, they were starting to construct something called the Fixed Federal Monitoring System. And this was a network of automatic radiation sensors distributed through 6,000 federal buildings across the country, which would automatically record and report the drift of fallout across the continent. Canada realized that this was a bit too sophisticated and expensive for them to successfully implement, so instead they looked at the system that they had built in the United Kingdom, which consisted of 1,500 manned bunkers that were crewed by members of the Ground Observer Corps. And this was an organization that was founded during the Second World War to spot and track attacking German aircraft. And so the Ground Observer Corps would man these bunkers, and they would make measurements of the fallout patterns and transmit them via radio link or telegraph and telephone lines to the Home Office. So in 1959, the government approved the construction of the Nuclear Detonation and Fallout Reporting System, or NDFRS. And this is an extraordinarily ambitious program which would have seen the construction of some 2,000 bunkers from coast to coast. And these were centered mainly around the main target cities and arranged in a grid south of the 55th parallel with around 15 mile separation north-south between bunkers and 43 miles east-west. And there were several different types of bunkers making up this system. The most common and smallest type was the fallout reporting post, just like the one here at Victoria Beach. And these would be manned by maybe 2 or 3 people and be equipped with radiological measuring instruments in order to detect and track fallout across the country. Now, around 200 of these were planned for Manitoba, about 100 were completed, and there's a handful still in existence today, including Bunker JF-12 here, and 4 others, which are GH3 at Devil's Lake, JG3 at Beaver Creek Provincial Park, HG1 at Goldeye Lake, and KE4 at Northwest Angle Provincial Forest. The second type of bunker was called the Nuclear Detonation Reporting Post, or NUDET, and these were equipped with a rather curious and very crude instrument for measuring the size and direction of nuclear detonations. This was colloquially known as the educated stovepipe, and this consisted of a piece of 2-inch pipe with holes drilled all around and filled with photosensitive polystyrene foam, just regular styrofoam. And the idea was that the altitude, the intensity, and the direction of a nuclear blast would be recorded by where and how deeply on the styrofoam a hole was burned by the flash. The British system actually had a very similar device, which used a pinhole camera system, and I'll show you a video of that right now being reloaded, where you had a piece of graph paper with a little pinhole that would focus the flash from the bomb, and then wherever the hole was burned on the paper told you where the nuclear detonation had occurred. And then they would triangulate all of these in order to track all the blasts across the country. So there were 3 NUDET posts in Manitoba, one at RCF Portage La Prairie, one at RCAF Gimli, and one at the Great Falls Generating Station. Now, both the fallout reporting posts and the NUDET posts would report their findings to another type of bunker called a filtering center. And these were manned by members of the Canadian Women's Army Corps who would collate all the information from these posts and turn it into usable intelligence that could then be transmitted to government headquarters and then broadcast to the entire nation so that people knew which areas to avoid. And this would be done, for example, using the emergency CBC transmitters at the Ottawa Diefenbunker. And so there were 2 of these filtering centers in Manitoba, one at Pine Falls Armory and one at the Brandon Armory. Now, to ensure that this project's construction proceeded as efficiently and cheaply as possible, the whole project was placed under the command of the Army, and the government mandated initially that all of the bunkers be built in the basements of existing government facilities. So, for example, D&D facilities, Army and Air Force bases, lands and forest offices, Royal Canadian Mounted Police and provincial police detachments, railway stations, Department of Transport weather stations, and things like that. And this accounted for about 3/4 of the necessary grid, and so it became necessary later on to actually approach private organizations and private individuals to make up the difference. Now, you're probably getting pretty tired of me just standing out here talking. You probably want to see inside the bunker, so why don't we actually go down and finish the story inside. Right, so these unusual objects sticking out of the ground here, which mark the entrance to the bunker itself, are actually ventilation stacks. These would be for providing fresh air to the bunker. They've got these caps on them to stop fallout, which is mainly radioactive dust from just falling in and contaminating the inside of the bunker. So the air would have to come in up under here and then down the pipe. Let's go have a look at the entrance. Right, so we have another ventilation stack here, and then this is how you get into the bunker. Some electrical conduits there, and then a nice little ladder. All right, let's head down. So, welcome to the interior of Fallout Reporting Post JF12. This is an incredibly claustrophobic space. I really wouldn't want to spend more than a couple of days in here. This is a steel cylinder barely 3 meters in diameter and 3 meters long, sunk into the ground, with barely enough room for 2 bunk beds, some shelves for holding food, water, decontamination equipment, radiation monitoring equipment, medical supplies, things like that, and a hand-cranked air pump for ventilation. And that's connected through a pipe to one of the 2 ventilation stacks up on the surface. But through my research, I haven't really been able to figure out whether one was intended to be an inlet pipe to bring fresh air in and the other an exhaust pipe to get stale air out, or whether one was redundant, intended for use if, say, one of them was damaged by the building collapsing on top of it. And on that note, this particular shelter, according to the locals here at Victoria Beach, once sat beneath the local post office. And this makes a lot of sense because the government tried as much as possible to build these shelters in the basements of existing government infrastructure. Though most of them were not of this type, most of them were just converted basements, although there were above ground examples, such as in Jasper Park, that were built where it was too remote to bring in heavy earth moving equipment to actually bury a bunker. Now, on the note of building under government buildings, the government thought that this was going to make the whole process a lot easier, more efficient, and cheaper. But it really didn't turn out that way. In fact, it turned out that due to bureaucratic infighting, it was much harder to deal with internal government departments than it was to deal with private interests. And there were a number of different reasons for this. For example, the military, which had been placed in charge of the Fallout reporting project, found that it didn't have the jurisdiction to deal with, say, the railroad companies to install shelters in railroad stations. The police detachments, the RCMP and the provincial police, they tended to operate in rural areas out of leased private homes. And so they didn't have the authority to approve the construction of a bunker in their basement anyway. The government had to deal with the private owners of the building. And in many cases, these police detachments didn't want the government converting their basement anyway. They were using their basement for other things, for storage or recreation or training or things like that, and they really couldn't be bothered to convert them. So there were a lot of problems. And these problems ended up causing a significant 2-year delay between the project being approved and construction actually starting. And the start of construction was spurred by an international crisis, the Berlin Crisis of 1961, which brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. So even when the project finally got underway, there were still significant problems, a lot of which were detailed in a memo written by one Major General John Rockingham. And one of the main problems he pointed out was that in eastern Canada, most of the telephone lines that were meant to be used by these shelters to report fallout movements ran through the Montreal Central Telephone Exchange, meaning that if Montreal was targeted by nuclear weapons, which it most certainly would be, these lines of communications would be obliterated, meaning that the military would have to build separate telephone and radio communication systems specifically for that system for it to work in that part of the country. He also pointed out that government buildings weren't plentiful enough to complete the entire project, and so the government would have to deal with private interests. And then there was the problem of cost. Shelters like this were not much bigger than the shelters that Canadians were expected to be able to construct in their own basements for around $500. But even with the government having these huge economies of scale, being able to buy materials in bulk and having their own dedicated workforce, etc., a shelter like this cost more like $800 to $1,000 to complete. So the cost of the project skyrocketed, and by 1963, they had spent more than $3 million on it, which in today's money is $26 million, so quite a chunk of change. But the last and most disturbing problem that Rockingham pointed out was that of staffing these bunkers in the first place. Bunkers like this are extremely small. They can only handle 2, maybe 3 people if you pack them in, meaning that anybody who volunteered to man one of these shelters would have to leave their families behind to die of radiation poisoning. And so Rockingham pointed out that not many people under those circumstances would want to volunteer. So the government changed the rules a little bit. They made a lot of these shelters a lot larger and said that if you volunteered to man a bunker like this, you were allowed to bring your family with you and keep them safe. But of course, there were further problems, and one of the main ones was a lack of radiation monitoring equipment. So when this plan was put together, these shelters were supposed to be equipped with one of these, an IM5015 remote radiac unit. So this is a radiation monitoring device with a separate head that would be mounted on a pole on the surface, and then you would have a long cable that would come down into the bunker, and you'd have your readout mounted on the wall, so you could stay safely in the bunker and measure the radiation outside. However, the Canadian military very quickly ran out of these units, and so most shelters would have been equipped with one of these, an IM108, which is a portable gamma ray meter. Now, that sounds fine until you consider that the occupants of one of these shelters were expected to take radiation readings every hour, meaning that every hour you had to suit up in protective equipment, calibrate your radiation meter, climb up out of the bunker, take your reading, and come back down, in the process exposing yourself to radiation, letting in fallout into the bunker, contaminating it and potentially your family if they're with you, and then wasting a considerable amount of your precious water supply, decontaminating yourself. And so given that you had to do this 24 times a day, essentially manning one of these bunkers became a suicide mission. Not that it ended up mattering much anyways, because the crisis that had spurred the Canadian government to start this project in the first place, the Berlin Crisis, ended peacefully with the construction of the Berlin Wall. And the very next year, the Cuban Missile Crisis also ended peacefully with both sides backing down. And so people started to realize that nuclear war was nowhere near as imminent or inevitable as they had been led to believe. And even up until this point, there was considerable apathy and fatalism among the Canadian public. Everybody thought, well, if the bomb drops, we're dead anyways. why worry about it? Let's just hope that it never happens. And the government really had to run fairly aggressive propaganda campaigns to essentially shame the Canadian public into caring about the threat of nuclear war and taking protective measures. But it really never worked all that well. But what finally killed this project was simply a lack of funds. At the end of the 1950s, beginning of the 1960s, the Canadian economy took a severe downturn, and the government found itself without the funds needed to complete the fallout reporting system. And so in 1963, the project was canceled after $3 million had been spent, and only 1,200 of the planned 2,000 bunkers had been built. And none of them were ever manned during a crisis or fully stocked with supplies or equipment. So the whole thing turned out to be something of an expensive waste of time. And so following 1963, most of the basement fallout shelters were converted back to their original purpose, but most of the ones that were of prefab construction like this still remain. And I'm just really happy to be able to show you the interior of this one. This really is something of a rarity. Anyway, that's all I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed this look at a very unique piece of Cold War history. I'm just pleased as punch to be able to have access to sites like this. And so I really want to give a huge shout out to Matt Metcalf and Danny Gibson, who arranged for me to be able to film here today, as well as to Gord Crosley, who first made me aware of the nuclear detonation fallout reporting system and the history behind this particular bunker. Thank you to all of you. Anyway, I'll see you next time on another episode of Cabinet of Curiosities, where we'll look at more fascinating artifacts just like this one. In fact, I'm planning an entire series on Cold War artifacts and nuclear, biological, and chemical warfare equipment, so stay tuned for that. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.